Welcome back. This is week 15, and we only have one lecture for this week because this is the last lecture of the course. And if you have gotten this far, following the all the previous lectures and modules, um, this is it. We've gotten to the end. And so this is the wrap up lecture. And the title is simply So What? Now, that is something that I usually pose, and it's usually the last lecture in my courses, because I think it is important at the end of the course to try to take stock of what we have done, where we have been, what we have gone through, and to ask the question, indeed, so what? What does this have to do with anything? I mean, obviously, it has to do with your final examination and your final grade for this course. I mean, all of the course up to this point. And I'll be addressing the final exam later on in this lecture. But I think it's important to look at it in the broader context. Um, Aside from, let's just say, personal interest, why is a course in the Reformation important? I obviously think it is, and I have indicated along the way several aspects of why I think this course is important, at least implicitly. But now I want to kind of take stock explicitly, at least obviously why I personally think this course is of importance to help put it in the broader scope of the world in which we live, so to speak. You can say that's maybe too grandiose, and that's fine. Um, but I think it's important to talk about the horrible term, which I've hated for a very long time, ever since I first decided to go to graduate school. That horrible term, relevance. What is the relevance of this course? And that is really the so what question. And relevance of this course and of history in general today is under attack, either implicitly or explicitly. Um, because it is, I won't go into all those issues, but you could say compared to the STEM subjects, the liberal arts are seen as not having nearly as much relevance to society as such. I'm not about to enter into a lengthy harangue in this last lecture of the importance of the liberal arts in general and history in particular. But I think it is important for students to see that broader perspective, which again, whether you accept it or not, is up to you, but at least to be presented with a view or a vision of why this is all important. Why are we doing this? It's not simply a side issue of, oh, isn't this something interesting that we can learn about? I mean, it can be that too, but it is somewhat more important, I think, and as well as the discipline of history itself. So that being said, we've made it. Congratulations. And you see, I've put the discussion of the final exam, final essay, at the end of this lecture. So you're going to have to suffer through this so what relevance issue to get to that part, even though I know you can just skip forward to that part. And I hope everyone will take that into and listen to it carefully when I start talking about the final exams. I think it will help a lot. But before we get there, we've covered a lot of material. We've covered everything from the onset of the crises of the later Middle Ages, um, the everything from the political religious crises with the conflicts between the emperors and the popes and princes and the popes, to the famine, the Black Death, this great schism, conciliarism, um, and calls for reformation. And these were calls for reformation in the 15th century and also in the 14th century. Going back to some of the earlier lectures in terms of observant movement. And even before the observant movement, the stringent calls in the monastic context, particularly which I discussed in terms of the Augustinian hermits, which I know fairly well, for the urgent need for reformation. And we can look back at that and say, yeah, but they didn't really mean Reformation. What they really meant was reform. So the term Reformation or Reformatio um, in Latin was simply reformare, the verb of to reform. And what we mean by Reformation is something different. And what it became, the meaning that it became attached to the term Reformation, became something new and different, beginning with Luther. Well, that is an approach I've argued against, both in my Luther and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, as well as in these lectures, because I said, that is taking an ahistorical and even a theological perspective and imposing it back onto the past. And so often that is done simply to offer evidence for our own positions, our own ideas, our own opinions, our own beliefs, rather than allowing the historical record to ask us questions, to challenge us. Not just to assume we know what they're talking about, but to say what really was their concept of Reformation. What do they mean by it? And is it worthy of our use of that term to refer to that period? Now, again, that is essentially the argument in my book, Luther and the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages, also as well in the early lectures. And the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, I think, is very clear, but it's not the only treatise written, the only texts available, the only pieces of excellent evidence that stringently call for the need for a reformation. And to see that in different light, rather than simply to see the Middle Ages, and especially the entire Middle Ages, as one uniform block where no one really fought for themselves and everybody just adhered to the authority of the Pope until Luther stood up and challenged that authority, is completely ahistorical. Now, I have up here, in terms of the so what question, the one slide that is here after the introduction, theology and history. And that certainly is a theme that I've addressed throughout. And I'm coming back to it here because in some ways, as no other period of history, I know maybe going out on a limb there, but as no other period of history in some ways, this chronological period from approximately 1300 to approximately 1600 forces the issue, because whatever happened, at least the catalyst or a catalyst, was certainly theological. Now, I think I mentioned before that from the 16th century to relatively recently, in the later 20th century, the predominant scholarship of this period of the Reformation has been based on theological positions, and often has been done by church historians, Protestant, Catholic, or otherwise. And then there are developments, actually in the 20th century, beginning in the 1960s, with the development of social history, begin to say, okay, yeah, you know what, theology is beyond us. We know it's an illusion anyway, so let's just kind of factor it out and let's look at the social developments or the political developments exclusively, and we'll just, put theology on a shelf, so to speak, because dealing with theology is a theological endeavor. Well, my point has been to argue as strongly as I can that there's two ways to approach the theology. And the theology of the 16th century, the theology of the Reformation in the more traditional sense. Namely, we can approach it theologically or we can approach it historically. And approaching it historically means to look at the impact of these beliefs. What are the doctrines being put forward? How did they come about? Where did they develop from? Are they new? Are they simply older positions kind of put in new clothes or new context, so to speak? What was really new about Luther's positions in his critique? Certainly not, his critique of the papacy was not new, at least at first. It took him a while to get to a new position when he really makes his discoveries, as I argue in 1520. That's not just the Pope that's the Antichrist, but the papacy is the throne of Antichrist. That was a huge change and a huge shift for Luther. And that is new because we don't find that previous. But previously we find assertions or attacks, even if simply polemical, that the Pope is the Antichrist. We see that with Louis of Bavaria and the Sachsenhausen Appeal, referring to John the 22nd, in that Franciscan insert in that document, which I talked about. Um, in some ways, we see it with Marsilius of Padua, his Defensor Pacis, when he calls for the abolition of the papacy. He doesn't see the papacy as the throne of Antichrist, but he sees the problems in Europe and the lack of peace in Europe being derived from an abuse of power of the papacy, of the Pope. So he offers this radical ecclesiology, as I've argued in Lutheran Reformation in the later Middle Ages, to over against the traditional hierarchical structure of medieval Christendom, with the two heads of the lay power and the secular power. The lay power and the ecclesiastical power. Lay and secular are the same. The ecclesiastical hierarchy and the lay hierarchy. So what really was new? Luther was not the first to attack indulgences. There were problems and grumblings about indulgences all over the place. I mean, that maybe might be going a bit too far. But his were the ones that took off. And were his arguments different from previous arguments? I mean, what does it mean when Luther also had that discovery in 1520 that he was a Hussite, not just himself, but in his view, so was Staupitz, so was Augustine, and so was even the Apostle Paul. He says we're all Hussites to the letter. That was a shock to Luther. And that's almost Luther coming to some semblance of a historical consciousness, meaning he's all of a sudden aware, oh my gosh, based on my interpretation, what Huss is saying is the same thing I'm saying, and that is the same thing that Staupitz has been saying, and that's the same thing that Augustine said, and that's the same thing that Paul said. Now, whether or not that is valid is a matter of interpretation of Paul, Augustine, Huss, and Luther. But in Luther's mind, that's what he believed. Now, so when I say that issue of beliefs is so important for history, and the historian, as an historian, if we can make that kind of a distinction, the historian as an historian, it's not the job or the responsibility of the historian to make estimations of the truth value of those statements. We can't really say as an historian that Luther was right and that Augustine was a Hussite, or that Paul was a Hussite. And so we can't say those things. But what we can say is that, first of all, Eck, Johannes Eck, one of Luther's most stringent Catholic opponents, referred to Luther as a Hussite, and Luther started in studying Huss and thought, oh my God, he's right. I am a Hussite because I think what Huss is saying is absolutely right. It's simply the gospel. But that is a theological position. And the Reformation obviously has significant theological importance and relevance on both sides, both on the Catholic side and then also on the Protestant side. Many of the Protestant denominations today, certainly not all of them, but let's say the mainline ones in general, can trace their heritage back to the 16th century. So to have an understanding of, let's say, religion in America in some ways, or religion also in general, we need to go back to this period. And also because this is also the period, the 16th century, when we have really what traditionally has been called this expansion of Europe, the ages of discovery, the beginnings of colonialization, the coming to terms with the so-called New World, at least with respect to Europeans. Certainly, the Native Americans didn't consider that they were the New World. They were the Old World, and we have these new invaders coming in, and so on. But it's like this was an amazing period of history. And so, theologically, it was significant because theologically it also had world implications for the entire world, at least theologically, but also historically. Now, there is a genuine relevance and significance for studying this period if you have any interest in the further development of religion and theological positions, the development of denominations, the issue of theology and religion in the United States today or worldwide. You need to have some understanding of the Reformation. But also, I would argue theologically, and here I'm taking off kind of my historian's hat and kind of trying to adopt a theologian's hat, even though I'm not a theologian as such. Um, if a theology and a theological interpretation and understanding is not based on history, it is bad theology. And if it's not based on good history, it can be bad theology. It'd be the same as saying, okay, I'm going to construct a new cosmology and interpretation of how the universe came into being, but I'm not really going to pay attention to the latest discoveries in physics or astronomy. I'm just going to pretend they didn't exist because I don't believe in them. So I'm just going to, assert my own views and opinions and dismiss what science has to tell us. That I think is, an irrational position because it's saying, no, I'm going to exclude the evidence that is there. And theologically, we can say, okay, if God is the creator of everything, then what is revelation of God's creation. And then, so theologically, are we excluding that? Are we, pretending that that's not what God actually did because we know better and we have our own beliefs and it's all of those things? That is a bad theology. It's almost even to a point of saying, it can even be considered theology. So to do good theology, it needs to be grounded in good history. I would argue theologically. And actually, I have an article I published um, that is an article in theology that makes this case, and that theology must be based on good history. And so it has importance in that sense. Now, I'm not going to continue talking along those terms because this is not a course in Reformation theology. This is not a course in theological hermeneutics or understanding. This is a course in history. And so in terms of the importance of history of this period, we need to really look at, again, what difference did this period of history make? How can we say, okay, theology is an inseparable historical factor, but not when dealt with theologically, but dealt with historically? We can't understand, I would argue, what happens in the 16th century, at least in the early parts of the 16th century, if we can't, through the 15th, up through the 1530s, let's say, if we can't understand the theological issues involved with the Eucharist and the real presence. For Luther, as well as for the traditional Catholic understanding, the traditional medieval understanding of transubstantiation, Luther's consubstantiation, and Zwingli's spiritual interpretation, representational, almost communal representation, and then Calvin's very much spiritual real presence, and on we go. Because at the time, people believed these things. People believed it. Belief, I would argue, in general, I'm not here talking specifically about any particular form of Christian belief, but just belief is the primary historical factor. We act based on what our beliefs, even if they're not expressed as beliefs. All of our assumptions. And those assumptions and beliefs form what I've referred to, I think, in a previous lecture as when I talked about ideology. The structures that allow us to make sense of our world. Those are based on beliefs. Now, those beliefs can be based on evidence or not, and that's the difference. And the trick is with history to somehow come into a position of understanding that harmonizes belief with the evidence. And I would say the same thing for theology. Theology is to come to a theological understanding based on the harmonization of theology and the evidence. But that's gets into other issues. For history, you can't factor out theology of the Reformation, which is a problematic term that I'll come back to, and have any kind of sense of historical understanding, of adequate historical understanding, partial or erroneous or whatever, but not really taking into account the vast complexity of how did this all come about. And in some ways, that is what this course has been about. That's what history is about. It is trying to discern how history changes, Why do people do the things they do, and what impact does that have? What difference does it make? And with history, we can't factor out one element and then rerun everything to see, what is the catalytic factor, or various catalytic factors. We have to simply make a lot of educated guesses and assumptions and arguments based on the evidence, the sources that exist. But yet, even with that, it's not simply as such. We could make an argument that theologically there's a relevance of being interested in Luther's writings as such, but historically there isn't. It's only what they unleashed, what they brought about, what impact did they have. That is what it fuels and drives historical change. And that is something that is still going on. Historical change is still going on. And in that sense, this period of European history, largely the long 16th century, let's say from 1300 to approximately 1600, called the Reformation, or what I call the Reformation, most scholars would go all the way back to 1300, but I do, was a major period of transition. The transition from the medieval paradigm to the early modern paradigm, from medieval Europe to early modern Europe. Also in other terms, more or less the same thing. Translation from the myth of Christendom to the myth of the nation state. And that's putting it in more ideological terms. But I think that's important to see those ideological structures that made this transformation so exciting, but also so problematic. It's difficult to have your mind radically changed. That was part of the problem Luther faced too. What do we do when we have, we get rid of Rome, we get rid of the structures of the medieval church as he goes on in the later 20s and on into the 30s and 40s. And we're getting rid of the sacraments except for baptism, the Eucharist, and then for Luther, he kind of goes back and forth at times, confession. Because people don't all of a sudden just say, "Oh, I'm with you, Martin. Yeah, I get that. You're telling me that we don't need the other sacraments? Okay, great. I don't have to worry about it. Then what about last rites?" It's kind of like where the rubber hits the road, so to speak. When you're on your deathbed, if you grew up in medieval Christendom with the sacramental system that was there, that is so ingrained in you that the last rites are something you need. And all of a sudden, a Protestant pastor, if you ask for the last rites, they'll say, "Nope, that's not a sacrament. We're not doing it. We can pray for you. We can be with you. We can try to tell you why it's not important." But on the experiential level, for the average person, this causes a sense of anxiety. Change and transition always brings about anxiety. At least for the old folks of us that are undergoing that were kind of brought up in the older system that is being transformed and changed, so to speak. And it can be dismissed by the new generation, so to speak. But that's not really grappling with the problem. It's just being dismissive. And as historians, we can't be dismissive. We have to try to understand. So, this period, and big transition periods, certainly the Reformation is not the only one. We can talk about, the transformation from the ancient world to the medieval world, fall of Rome, and all that. That's a major one. We can talk about the upheavals that associated with the transformation of the early medieval world to the early modern world to the modern world, brought about by the upheavals of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, Industrial Revolution. And right today, our society and culture in the West, but also not limited to the West as such, is itself in a period of transition from the modern paradigm of modernity to postmodernity. Even the problematic aspects of that term, postmodern, indicate that anxiety and transition, because, like, what do we call it? modern always meant, and it's certainly not a modern, and modernity is not a modern word. 12th century, they were talking about the modernity of moderns, always meant like us today. So the issue is, we went from early modern to modern, and then where do we go next? And so it's kind of a postmodern, but then when that paradigm at some point establishes itself and becomes the norm, if it ever does, what will come after postmodernity? Are we going to simply have postmodernity? I mean, that is the problem with categorization and terminology to try to understand what is going on, what is happening to our world, and we're in that type of a transition period, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. But trying to look to then previous transitions for some insight into what affects and brings about such changes makes such transitions relevant to today on the historical basis, even on the personal basis, above and beyond anything else. So in some ways, we look to the Reformation as this period of transition from one ideological structure to another ideological structure, from one myth operating system to another myth as an operating system, from medieval to early modern, to see what were the factors that led to this and affected this and brought this about and made it possible to begin with. Those are the questions we need to ask ourselves today. Where is it that we're going? And we don't know yet. You say, well, I know we're going in this direction. Well, maybe. A lot of people are saying, no, we need to go back to where we were. But no, I'm not one of those, believe me. Even though I'm still part of the older paradigm that is in a period of constant anxiety because of all the changes. But it's like, we can't ever go back. We can only go forward. But the problem is, where is it that we're going? We don't know yet. We don't know what this postmodern paradigm, what it's going to look like. There's postmodern theory in literature. There's postmodernity in philosophy. There's different aspects of postmodernity that have become fairly well established. But as a whole, as a culture, society, as a new ideological structure, as a new myth, what's that going to look like as a whole? We don't know. And what is bringing it about? We don't know. And so often those types of questions can only be answered to some extent, or at least to the sense that they can be answered historically. And that's why we look back to the past. But that type of approach in terms of this transition brings up the issue of historical change as such. So in one sense, the Reformation is important because we could argue as follows. We can't understand ourselves today and what's going on today if we don't understand what, the history and development of the 20th century. We can't understand the history of the 20th century without understanding the developments and history of the period of modernity, of which the 20th century probably formed part of that beginning of the transition. The new physics and all this, that goes back to the early 20th century, before it really gets into other fields of human knowledge and endeavor, but still is so thoroughly grounded in the modern paradigm. So we can't understand modernity or postmodernity unless we can understand modernity. We can't understand modernity really unless we understand that from which it came, namely early modernity, the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries. Can't understand in the Reformation unless we understand that from which it came, namely the medieval Christendom. We can't understand medieval Christendom and its origins and developments and components and how it actually functioned historically, not as we read back into it and as we try to make it to fit our own understandings of grandeur that we are today, but no, as it actually functioned. If we don't understand the world out of which it came, namely antiquity, we can't understand the Roman Empire and the fall of Rome, not understand the fall of the Roman Republic. Can't understand that without understanding the emergence of the Roman Republic, which goes back to the Hellenistic world, And the empire of Alexander the Great, we can't really understand Alexander the Great without understanding classical Greece and Sparta and Athens and those aspects, and we can't really understand the Greeks and the emergence of Greek culture and traditions without going back to ancient Mesopotamia and the very origins of civilization itself. In some ways, it goes all the way back. We can't understand any of this development unless we can understand somehow the very beginnings of human beings and human culture and human society. Because how can we understand human civilization if we don't understand human culture? How can we understand human culture if we don't see the very origins and development of human culture? And are we talking about the human culture of simply of Homo sapiens, or are we also going back to early hominid culture? And then if we need to understand it in those terms, we need to go all the way back to the emergence of the earliest hominids. And we have to go back to the earliest hominids, to the earliest forms of life. Where does that come from? And then we get back all the way to the origins of the universe. So in some ways, we can't really understand the Reformation without understanding the origins of the universe. Or we can't understand where we are today and where we're headed without understanding the origins of the universe. Now, that may be seen as like, oh, yeah, I see where you're going with this. Ha, ha, ha. You're making it into this universal thing. Well, actually, I would argue it is if we put it in the whole perspective. Now, I can't sit and tell you about all those different transition periods. We all scholars specialize in some of them, and there are specialists, specialized scholars in all of the periods, but there's no single scholar that looks at everything. So I didn't start this course by saying I'm going to talk to you about the Reformation, but to understand it, we need to go back to the Big Bang. That's not really feasible because we break it up. We break history up and historical change up into something that we think of as manageable sections of some sort, somehow made. I teach, or I used to anyway, but they're still in the books, like 4 courses covering the Middle Ages and up to through the Reformation. Early medieval, high and late medieval, the Renaissance, and then the Reformation. 4, just 2 years to cover a lot of this, and at least 1 year, later Middle Ages or high and later Middle Ages, and then Reformation to cover. I've tried to cover in this course. And how do you do it? I don't know. I have to get ready to teach this course this summer, summer 1, by the way, so to speak. And that's a 6-week course. So how am I going to squeeze all of this into 6 weeks? Something is lost. Something is always lost when we have to artificially make demarcations, starting points, ending points. It's unavoidable. But we need to be aware of the broader context and the broader complex in which these periods of transitions find themselves. Now, is that relevant to us today? I would say absolutely, because we can start with this. How can we understand ourselves today? How can we understand the impact of the age of technology and computers and the information age, so to speak, unless we understand how things were beforehand? You can't say, oh my God, it took you maybe a week to write a letter, and that's how you had to get, communicate back and forth if you weren't, there in person. How did anything ever get done? Things got done very well, thank you very much. But all of a sudden, that development of email, social media, that's had such a huge and profound impact on our society as such. We can't really understand that impact unless we understand what had come before. Yes, the Reformation is relevant to today. Maybe not as such, but for everybody. But in the sense of understanding historical change and development, how it takes place, what are the factors involved, and what does that have to do with us today? In some ways, that is the question that or the prompt that I ask for the discussion for this week. So what about the Reformation, and what does it have to do with us today? I'm not saying that you have to repeat everything I said. I want you to think about it yourself. I want you to reflect on what I've said. Okay? Does that make sense with my own experience? Um, how do I deal with these issues? Is that really the case or not? And why? Not why not? If so, why so? Put it in the broader perspective. That is what the discussion for this week really is at. That is what this course, as a history course, seeks to get at. Going back to a period that is very foreign to us today. Back to a period that it's almost impossible for us to really understand. Going back to a period when theology, religion, and politics were all one and the same. There was no concept of the separation of quote unquote church and state. There was no concept that politics was not also theological, theology was not also political. Even if a distinction could be making that if I'm, teaching at a theology in a university in the 15th century, I'm not trying to think of, what's the emperor doing and how do I impact that. But it is an issue of what are we doing and what's all about. And it's hard to kind of try to put ourselves back in those times to see things as they saw them. And that's the key, to see things as they saw them, or at least by the means through which they saw things. And I may have already referenced this, that Clifford Geertz, a cultural anthropologist, has a great essay from the natives' point of view. And he says, we can never really get to the natives' point of view. We can never really understand what it's like to be a native. The closest we can get with a lot of hard work and effort and a lot of time and experience and observation and study is to try to see their world through the lenses with which they viewed their world. It takes a lot of work to get to that point. It's not simply to look back and say, gosh, they were so stupid. They didn't realize these things. They were backwards. It is to try to say, how did they conceive of things? And if something strikes us as odd and weird, strange, how are we to understand that? It's not to say that we accept it. It's not to say that that's all good. But if we can't understand why heretics were put to death, we're not going to understand medieval Christendom or early modern Europe. Because heretics were seen as a threat to the eternal salvation of people's souls. People who were subjects within a given kingdom or realm or political entity, the leaders of which were responsible, or considered themselves responsible for the spiritual well-being of their subjects, looking toward eternal salvation. We can say eternal salvation is a personal issue. Fine. Gosh, why did they consider it such a big deal for everybody? Well, so those places that we're caught up and find as different and odd and question, like, what? You got to be kidding me. How did they do that way? Are places that we should really investigate and go into. Why was it so? Did they view it that way? Which is not to say, that yes, we should still burn heretics. I'm not for burning heretics in any way, shape, or form. I'm not even all that thrilled with the concept of heresy or heretics. But I would still argue that if we can't understand how medieval and early modern Europe, how and why they burned heretics and saw that as being essential, we're not going to understand the period. Of course you burn heretics if you take your responsibilities seriously enough. Now, also, to realize that doesn't mean that every quote-unquote heretic was burned at all, because the bureaucratic administrative apparatus wasn't there to ferret them out. Talking about the increasing lack of toleration as a result of the Reformation. That goes along with the growth of bureaucratization of the early modern state and the period of confessionalization that I've talked about. Greater attempts are made to extend the arms of government to ferret out heresy. The witch trials. Is all that relevant today? Because how do we force conformity? And is conformity even an ideal that we should have? What does it mean to be a state, country, people, so to speak? It seems that in this country anyway, but certainly not just in this country, we are, even as such, in a period of crisis where we don't really know what's going to happen. And the lack of uniformity, the lack of conformity, the lack of oneness is increasingly devolving into increasing divisiveness. How are we to handle that? What does that really mean? Can we ever get beyond the so-called nation state? Can we ever get beyond the form of human organization that is deemed as civilization? If so, how so? If then why and why not? And how do we do those things? So yes, these questions and issues, I would argue, are directly relevant to us today in the world in which we live today. And that includes the Reformation and everything we've talked about and read and looked at in this course. On whatever level of relevance, of importance, however you might answer for yourself the so what question, whether it's on this global, universal level, or whether it's simply more on a very specific level, or even a personal level. I hope this course has allowed you to explore this period in greater depth than you have before. I hope it has questioned you, challenged you. I hope that you either already have or will, at some point in the near future, come to a new understanding of it all and of yourself in relationship to it. Change is difficult. Changing of opinions and assumptions is difficult, yet necessary. If you don't ever do something difficult, you'll never do anything as human beings. I hope everyone is challenged. I hope everyone's opinions and beliefs have been challenged. Which is not to say I want to undermine all of your opinions and beliefs and ideas. That's not my purpose whatsoever, but rather to actually strengthen them. It is only when we challenge and when we are confronted with evidence that we can come to a new understanding, even if the basic position is the same. That basic position can be placed on far firmer ground. In some ways, this gets me back to what I started with, in some ways, in this lecture, namely, whether it is a theological position, a philosophical position, a political position, the assumptions we have about these things, whatever they may be, if they're not in harmony with the evidence, they are bad positions. They are irrational positions. They are uneducated positions, and that's what education is all about, to challenge what we think. And that is why education never stops. It's not going to stop or shouldn't stop. I pray it won't stop for all of you or any of us when you graduate and get your degree. I certainly hope it won't stop for any of you after you submit your final exam. Because education is the ongoing endeavor, and it's an exciting endeavor, even though it's challenging and difficult and filled with anxiety, of seeking to understand what it's all about. Why do I believe what I believe? What is it based on? How can I come to a deeper, broader, more sophisticated understanding than I have at this point? That necessitates shaking things up. That's what this is all about. All right. Thank you for sticking with me these past 15 weeks or so. You still have your final exam due. So I do want to go over that a bit. There is the posted guide to writing the final exam, which I hope you will pay close attention to. Again, it talks about the font and the page numberings and those things, or page length, expected page length, 12 to 15 pages. Because if you ignore those, what it says to me is, I don't care. I don't care what the rules are. I'm going to do whatever I want. And that is not a good way to get the type of grade that I'm assuming you want. Because grading is based on the extent to which you, in some ways, follow the rules, at least in terms of submission of your final, and apply the course material to the problem given to you. So all lectures are part of the final. All the readings are part of the final. That does not mean you can simply repeat all the lectures and copy verbatim all of the readings. That would not be appropriate. You have to analyze these things and choose how best to answer the problem given you. Now, if we look at the question for the final,